and I'm sure that our guests tonight will join me in welcoming you to give the talk, Lessons from Iraq.
Well, I wish in the time since I left my post, I would every day experience so much warmth and welcome and friendship as I did since I arrived here yesterday. And I'm very, very grateful to you, Dr. Higgins, for the good dinner, the good exchanges we had, the good laughs we could have, even though the rest of the evening, I'm afraid, won't be much about laughing and jokes. I wish I could have come to discuss what I always wanted to. A publishing house once asked me, now you have written your book on Iraq, what next? And I'm not facetious when I say to you that as a young civil servant in the UN, I always wanted to write a book about humor, United Nations humor. And yes, and the publishing house, the woman at the other end of the line, I heard her swallowing because she couldn't understand that there was humor in the United Nations. But there were good years, and the life, 32 years in the UN, I can assure you, with the exception maybe of these hard, tough 2 years in Baghdad, or almost 2 years, I wouldn't want to miss a day. The United Nations was a wonderful experience that brought together. We lived in a way, the United Nations, the others tended to talk about it. So I'm glad I'm here. I'm very glad I'm here. And I'm grateful, as I said, to Dr. Higgins, but I'm also very grateful to you, Dr. Selzak, for receiving me so friendlily and to be kind to me, and to Dr. Neil Ayer, who has prepared a visit to Canada, which was meant to take. I was supposed to be with you last year. Then it wasn't possible for an accident I had, but now it's all possible thanks to the good contact we had. And let me try now to put before you what I experienced and how I see things after reflecting a lot since my resignation I'm supposed to put on a button here. I hope you can hear me better now. Good. I have done a year and a half of really introspection and thinking and looking at documents, and here it is what I have to say to you. I started my trip in Winnipeg. I saw on the television the last days of battles that were fought in Torino at the Olympics. And what came to my mind is, if all the battles that one can fight, should fight, were of the kind that we saw on television in Torino, with the glorious victories of people like Cindy Clausen, I think then I would propose we should fight more battles. But unfortunately, the other world in which we live is a different kind of world, and I experienced, after 30 peaceful, good years in an organization that isn't as corrupt and as incompetent as you read in the press, the last 2 years were slightly different. I guess the question that one could ask, or the statement rather one could make, is, if there was no United Nations, one would have to invent it. I often say that as an entry into a debate on Iraq. And I don't think in this room here, I hope that there's no one who objects to this statement. The debate will not be whether we should have a UN or not. The debate will be over what kind of a United Nations do we need and do we want. And there are wide perceptions on the subject. One sees extremes, immense extremes. One extreme, well, you will chuckle as I did, but it's really nothing to laugh about, when somebody said the United Nations needs to consist only of one member state. The rest is immaterial. That was said by no less a person than John Bolton on the 15th of November last year in New York, representing his government at the United Nations. The other extreme is an extreme of dreamers. We must all dream, but that maybe is a dream that will not materialize very quickly, and that is the United Nations should become a world government, should represent all of us like a government. Well, I would say that is not likely to happen. The United Nations, as the Financial Times some time ago said, is flawed. Who would disagree with that? As an insider, I certainly agree with that, but is vital. But before I begin into a critical analysis of the United Nations, let us for just a moment pause and take stock of what this body, how it has evolved over these 60 years. And one can scratch the surface in a way, but let me just very briefly say, in 60 years, the United Nations has created a network of structures that are covering with their tentacles almost every field of human needs, every field of human knowledge. So we have the network, we have the outreach. And what about the content? We have the content also. And you know, you have read, in fact today I bought a book in your bookstore which talks about the United Nations having convened these big international conferences. What a waste of time was it said there. What a ridiculous waste of time. People getting together, 10,000 in Cairo to discuss population, an equal number in Beijing to discuss gender issues, 8,000 to 10,000 in Copenhagen to discuss social issues, lesser number but still many to discuss human rights in Vienna, a large number of people coming together in Istanbul to talk about housing, many people meeting water specialists in La Plata in Argentina to talk about water issues. What a waste of time, what a waste of money. I so fundamentally disagree with that. These big conferences were just the tiny tip of an iceberg. Behind it was tough, hard work at national level to get clarity on these issues, to get legislation into place, to appoint people who could follow up after the conference. So what you saw was maybe that which was the most superficial. People meeting somewhere and talking, debating, disagreeing, but the outcome was on the plus side, I can assure you. I served in India as the UN representative at the time when Beijing, the Women's Conference, took place. The Indians worked hard. The Indians passed a law to make India join the Convention on the elimination of discrimination against all forms of discrimination against women, the CEDAW Convention. There was follow-up, small groups met, NGO networks became more active than they were. So no question that there was a good, solid contribution. That created the content. So you have the structures, you have the content, and the third element, over the years, international law was created. I mentioned one convention already, that is international law, but there was a whole range of important law created. There were the two conventions on civil, political, cultural, social, and economic rights. There was, with Canadian support, the Landmine Convention that was passed into international law. There's the Genocide Convention that became a reality. There was a Torture Convention that was adopted. So we have structures, we have content, we have law, and in the books, in a university for young people, for students, it looks as if the package is a good deal to make our life better, more meaningful. And the reality is, of course, and that's the challenge for us, is that there is such a wide gap between where we are today in our lives and where we could be if we would take this whole business of international agreements to live in harmony with each other more seriously. And that one can pursue further and ask the question, what are the reasons for this gap that exists? There are many reasons. And I cannot do justice to going into too much detail, but I want to pick out two that to me personally are very important factors. One is no doubt the dynamics of globalization. And it is difficult for me to understand how one can be anti-globalization. We can be anti the type of globalization we see, but globalization is taking place and we will not be able to prevent this. So we must give direction to it. But I come back to this. The one factor that explains the gap is globalization. The other factor that is making itself visible every single day is unilateralism, is the fact that there's one country that decides to use the international community like a toolbox. You use it when it's convenient and you do what you want when it isn't. I haven't come here as a populist. I have not come here to be an anti-American. I'm not at all. I am a product of American education also. I studied here, part of my studies here, part in Germany. My wife is from America. So I don't want to at all be classified as anti-American. I'm not. But I take the position that many Americans take, that are critical of what is happening in Washington. This unilateralism clashing with the dynamics of globalization, I think, is a major cause for this gap that is not getting any closer. And we now, as people, as individuals, as leaders in universities, in government, and wherever, we must really come to grips with the question, on which road do we want to travel in globalization? One could take the view, the book is outside, I'm quite impressed that it is there. One could take the position of what I call market Darwinism, where everything is about economics. We jokingly said, I will not tell you, it's not quite fair, a UN agency that is very concerned with profits, with economics, and so on. We said this agency is only looking at things as important if you can count it. What you cannot count doesn't count. That's not the approach. I don't think the road in globalization is that road of an unlimited free market approach to life, where we lose more and more what I think in this university you want to emphasize, and that is humanness. So I count that out. But there is a beautiful, maybe you would call it also naive, I don't know, but there's a beautiful definition of what globalization is about. And this beautiful definition comes from Professor Johan Galtung, whom Dr. Ayer and I met not long ago in Frankfurt, who in a debate with Samuel Huntington, you have heard of him in the Clash of Civilization publication and other important books that he has written, they debated globalization. And the definition that he has is just magnificent, and I want to read it to you. A system in which men and women, the three generations which inhabit Earth at the same time, all races, all classes, live together in dignity. I think that's a beautiful definition of globalization. And that is, in fact, what this is all about. The United Nations Charter is about that. It's about tolerance, it's about equal opportunity, it's about social and economic progress for all, and I think that's the road to travel on. A word about unilateralism. There is so much being written. In Europe, a lot is being discussed about the intentions of the present administration. I think it's a little bit unfair to just point the finger at the present administration. When you are decade after decade a world leader, you forget, or there's a chance, there's a danger that you forget that you are part of a system. And you think the system must turn to you, and not you be part of that system. I think one wastes time if one speculates here too much about what is that content of the American approach. For me, I looked at many documents, but the two that stand out, that explain to me best what the philosophy behind the American approach is one, the Project for the New American Century, the PNAC document that you can see. You can download it if you want. You can find it in libraries. And what the current administration in Washington has taken out of that document and converted into a national security strategy. When you read these two documents and you compare the content with what is happening right now, most recently, a week ago or 10 days ago, when General Pace, before the US Congress, explained the new defense strategy, talking about a long war, talking about the fact that one can have multiple military interventions in a range of countries at the same time in order to combat, his words, not mine, extremist, fundamentalist Islamism, a strange combination of three heavy words, then one understands, I think, very well what we see and read in the papers these days. And I would say there are other manifestations of unilateralism that are much more concrete. There is an unwillingness to accept the International Court of Justice. There's an unwillingness to accept the convention that you have helped to bring about, the Landmine Convention. There's an unwillingness to accept the Kyoto Protocol on environment. There's an unwillingness even to join such harmless international agreements like the Convention on the Rights of the Child. There are now, I keep smilingly, but it's really not so very funny to refer to the fact that 2 countries out of the 191 member countries of the UN have not signed that Convention on the Rights of the Child. One is Somalia, that has no government practically, and the other one is the US, a founding member of the United Nations. So we then have Iraq. Iraq is another example of unilateralism. People didn't want, even people in countries like Spain and Italy, whose governments initially supported this war or invasion in Iraq, but the people there didn't go along, didn't want. So there is a great amount of isolation surrounding the Iraq approach as far as the US is concerned. Then there's a third level. That's more a level within the UN that is a problem here that explains gaps of achievement. One of which is the fact that there is no clear division of labor between the Security Council here, the General Assembly here, and the International Court of Justice here. And the Security Council over the years has more and more usurped the leadership role in all aspects of decision-making in the UN that wasn't meant to be that way. So there's a need for a division of labor. There's no acceptable to me and to many others who know the UN coordination within that UN system. And there are many other areas that need to be looked at now in the context of the UN reform discussion. And this is happening, as I verified just this morning. There are new reports about the progress of the debate. It will be very difficult if there is this conception that the UN needs only one member country, and the desire to reform an institution to make it more equal, more democratic. Then I think you can see that the reform debate ahead is going to be a heavy one. One big problem that I, in my work in Iraq, had to struggle with was the consensus approach in the Security Council, particularly when it came to the formulation of resolutions. They were only likely to pass when you worded a resolution in such general terms that anyone could interpret it happily as they wished and wanted. That's okay when it doesn't involve the security and the lives and the survival of people. But when it's a question of peace or war, then consensus resolutions can be very dangerous, as we have seen in very concrete terms. Let me just give you 4 words that make my point. Iraq must have completed all actions, it said in one resolution. Iraq must have fully cooperated. Iraq, if it is in breach of agreement, will face serious consequences. Now, what I've read to you, if we made a survey now, everyone has to write down what they meant, what they interpret a serious consequence, a breach of agreement. Well, in the Security Council, that was the same. There was no agreement on the definition of these terms. And this was ultimately a welcome basis, this resolution 1441 of November 2002, to justify going to war. Because Washington and London saw a breach of agreement where the others didn't. And the serious consequences were not more a pressure, maybe more sanctions, a stricter embargo, but going to war. So it is unfortunate that for many reasons that we cannot, as a people, as citizens, wherever we live, accept the big conflicts of our time, whether it is North Korea, whether it is Palestine, whether it is Iraq or now Iran, whether it is the terrorism debate, or whether it is even such simple, on the surface, issues as bringing development to countries that need it, the Millennium Development Goals. Even there are serious disagreements, and the United Nations has not been able to play the leadership role that you and I would have wanted and expected. So there is a case for an enormous urgency for getting the Reform Act in place and on the road. And Iraq is for me a fantastic example that can demonstrate the weaknesses of this United Nations leadership. Now remember, before I continue, I just want to say, by talking a little bit about Iraq, if you have lived 30 years under dictatorship, if you have had 2 wars, first against Iran and then the Second Gulf War in 1991, if you had 13 years of economic sanctions, if you had one invasion, and you had after that 3 years of occupation, how much, I ask you, can a people take? How much can individuals bear, families, groups, tribes, communities? It is, to me, a miracle that the Iraqis are still able to handle this, even though we see already the deterioration of what once was a fairly harmonious interaction. What you see now is not the Iraq that existed during the last many decades, where you get sectarian strife, where the newspapers write about civil war, the end of Iraq, a breakup. All of that is, I would say, a distant, not likely to me, possibility. But it is a very serious situation that the Iraqis are facing, and they are carrying it with an admirable amount of ability, I would say. Now, I want to say for a few moments something about this human catastrophe as it evolved up to the March 2003 war. It was politically very convenient to put cause and effect into a pot and make a cocktail out of this, so that you could not see anymore very clearly who was the cause for what. That served many people. But I think it is now time that we look at it again and ask the question, can we disentangle this? Can we ask the question, on whose account does this go, and does this go, and does this go? And my answer is, it is absolutely possible. It is possible to say, this goes on the account of Saddam Hussein and his government. And the big picture about the brutality of a dictator is painted. What you see now in Iraq, and what you will probably see soon as the end of the life of a person, Saddam Hussein, when he will be executed, will be on the basis of a fairly small, in the scheme of things, brutality, involving only, in quotation marks, 148 people who lost their life because of an execution order that he gave. That was done very clearly for reasons that you can imagine, as fairly unknown issue on which other people couldn't intervene and say, no, it was not like that. So the big picture about the brutality, I think we cannot argue. He was a person who is to answer now to justice, and that means we can discuss the detail. We will discuss the detail. Academics, scholars will go into the question to the extent to which he was involved in brutal intervention in Iraqi Kurdistan, to what extent he was responsible for Halabja, to what extent he was involved in decimating the Marsh Arabs, the Madan in southern Iraq, the assassinations of Ayatollahs. All this, many PhDs probably will be written on the details of this part of Iraq's recent history. But one doesn't have to now debate whether or not that man was a dictator with brutal policies or not. And in fact, let me just say, it's a terrible thing maybe to say it, but I want to say it. The brutality of Saddam Hussein was much more transparent than what I consider the brutality of the UN Security Council. The UN Security Council, this was more hidden. It was not so easily, I come to that. But Saddam Hussein's brutality was even codified. There is a decree number 96 of the Iraqi Penal Code where it shows that if a person is caught with foreign currency in his pocket for more than one occasion, he or she will lose a limb, limb will be amputated. That's not why I'm telling you this. That's bad enough. But it goes into more detail. And it says if a pregnant woman will be caught with foreign currency for more than one occasion, she will have her arm or leg amputated 4 months after the birth of her baby. So that was in writing, one could see it. What came out of the Security Council, there was no coded or written brutality, but the impact of the policy out of New York was often very brutal. Now, what goes into the second account, the account of the occupying powers, the UK and the US particularly, I would say what goes into that account, if you take this metaphor of accounts, the deposits are still made daily. So we cannot define a final picture of that yet, but you have seen as much as I've not been back in Iraq since the war started, so you know very well what the picture is here, and the account shows a pretty grim picture of 2 permanent members of the UN Security Council. Then comes the last account, and that's the account with which I am quite familiar, and that is the Security Council sanction account. Let us remember that 1990 was a legal beginning of sanctions. Sanctions were imposed quite correctly and in accordance with international law. After all, Iraq moved into another country and sanctions were imposed. What started legally continued increasingly illegally because the basis on which these sanctions were imposed was not a basis that really ensured the protection of the civilian population. There's a saying that I like, grass does not stay under the rock. Facts are coming out eventually, and the facts are now out. We can take an X-ray of the human catastrophe in Iraq, and I've written many pages on that. I can only very briefly summarize something, and I want to do this with five figures. If you can just for a moment concentrate on the figures, difficult. When you talk about $63 billion was the total oil income during the Oil for Food program. 63 billion as licit income, legal, not illegal. There was an illegal component, that's another story. But the legal one was $63 billion. 44 out of the 63 billion were available for the humanitarian program, for the Oil for Food program, 44 billion. Out of the 44 billion, only $28 billion were actually utilized for supplies to arrive in Iraq to help a population of, on average, 23 million people. If you take this number, 23 million people getting $28 billion worth of humanitarian supplies during 6.5 years, then you get a per capita per year figure per year of $185. And if you then bring it down to a level that you and I can easily understand, per day, per person, it is less than what on your campus a cup of coffee costs. 51 cents. 51 cents was all that was available on a per capita basis per day to the people of Iraq during this much talked about Oil for Food program. And keep in mind, somebody reminded me rightly so that I did forget to say, to add that there was no other income. That was for 60 to 70 people all that they had. 4 oranges in Baghdad when I was there cost 1,000 dinars, and a school teacher would earn between 5,000 and 6,000 dinars. That school teacher couldn't buy 4 oranges. It was impossible. So 51 cents is a figure that speaks for itself, I would say. And the Security Council knew this. You see, that is the big thing to remember, that the Security Council was aware. And if you are aware and you do not change your policy, then the issue of intent comes in, and then soon someone will come, well, that is then deliberate, and therefore it's a violation of international law. And some people, I say this very mildly to you, but other people have said it brutally. You will read articles about genocide and a terrible description of the violation of international law. And I must add here that while the UN Security Council knew this, it didn't do what was supposed to be done, what we suggested should be done. For example, we proposed year after year the introduction of a cash component. No nation can be run without cash. You need cash to pay your civil servants, your embassies abroad, your hospitals, your infrastructure. All of that requires cash inputs. Under sanctions, no cash was legally allowed. And the American and British governments were very insistent that there wouldn't be any cash transaction for fear, so they argued that this would be used for weapons of mass destruction. So it's strange that this approach explains to some extent the degree of smuggling of oil, the degree of illicit income, kickbacks, surcharges that was necessary to a large extent to get the cash that they needed. And that it went into other pockets also, that it went into the construction of palaces and the purchase of luxury goods is another matter. But the major part of that cash was needed to run the nation. Now, I want to just also explain the difference between the first figure, 63 billion, and 44. What happened to these 19 billion that Well, 99% of that money went to the Compensation Commission in Geneva to pay companies, firms, governments, and individuals for claims that they made against Iraq for losses they suffered because of Iraq's invasion into Kuwait. That's fine. There's nothing wrong per se with asking for compensation. The only problem is that that money was released at a time when child mortality, for example, was increasing tremendously, much higher than it was during sanctions. I have the figures. I don't have the time now to give them to you, but the figures are there. Are they accurate? That's an academic debate. But they are trend indicators. They show that something went very seriously wrong during these years of sanctions, and many more children died, many more adults died because of a wrong, that is a fact, unfortunately, wrong international policy. There were many deceiving approaches. This is what was so hard for us in Baghdad, that we wanted to make our case in an honest, transparent way, showing the figures, and it ended invariably in an attempt to manipulate the data. And unfortunately, policy in Washington and in London made facts and not facts policy. This was terrible, but that was the reality we faced. When we said food was well distributed to the people, when medicine was not stockpiled unnecessarily, but only for example, there was an upsurge in the warehousing with medicines because Iraq finally accepted the World Health Organization recommendation to stockpile some medicines to protect against the outbreak of an epidemic. Well, we read, and we could do so little, we were so helpless, that we read then in official statements from Washington and London that the government of Iraq was selling food, that the Iraq government was stockpiling. Well, I'm not here before you to defend the government of Iraq, but I'm stating facts that this was simply absolutely not true. And then the picture of inadequacy, the picture of suffering, the economic indicators, well, you pick one and it would be horrible. Unemployment, 60 to 75%. Child mortality rates were between 100 and 200 of children under 5 per 1,000, as distinct to 25, which was already high before sanctions. In Canada, the figure is 5. 5 children in Canada die per 1,000 under 5 for various causes, while in Iraq, in the days when I was there, it was between 100 and 120. That figure is disputed by some academics. There's a debate. That's fine. No problem. But the trend is still clear that there was an excess mortality, excess suffering that was necessary and for which the UN, not the government of Iraq, must take responsibility. I want to move on a little bit faster. Otherwise, in this room, I can't even see whether people are closing their eyes already. But if you do, then raise your hand, and I will move even faster. But I must simply add to make you more troubled. We have to be troubled. I do not subscribe to what European politicians right now try to argue, and that is, for the sake of transatlantic friendship, we must look forward and not backwards. Yes, we have to look forward, but without accountability for what happened in countries like Iraq, I think that isn't permissible. And wherever you look, these indicators that I refer to, they really force you to make sure that those who were instrumental in pursuing these kind of policies, that they are held accountable. I could tell you for an hour about conditions in Iraqi schools when I was there. You would not believe it, how the schools were there, how primary children would go to dilapidated schools. There were no chairs. The parents had to give their children chalk so that the teachers had something to write on blackboards if they had a blackboard. Books. Don't think there were books. Many schools worked without or practically without books. In one school, I was careless. I took a book out of the little bookshelf in this primary school, and the pages were on the floor because it had no more binding. It was fingered. Pages were torn. It was a complete chaos. And an old man in Mosul once said to me, they first tried to kill us physically. Now they're trying to kill us mentally also. Because the school system was just at any level, tertiary, primary, secondary, it was terrible. And this was not unknown. After all, we were there. The Security Council was made aware of it. And as I keep saying, did much too little to do something about it. One major factor which made us, I must repeat that also, very helpless was this deliberate, I call it institutionalized lying, disinformation, purposely disinforming. If you go today into your press, you will see a reference to a decision by General Casey in Iraq to continue with planting positive articles through payment into the Iraqi press. Well, that is now, they are there now, but before it was in other ways. And we would all the time face this problem. But we faced something else. We faced the misuse of the UN. In New York, you have read the listening devices in the office of the Secretary General. In Baghdad, we had them also. We had them, however, in ambulances that had sophisticated listening devices, UN ambulances in Iraq, while ambulances that we wanted to import, 800 ambulances, I was told cannot be imported until the telephones are taken out of the ambulance. How can you have an ambulance without the link to the doctor or to the hospital? Well, we had to take the telephones out. Then we got the ambulances, and subsequently I found out that the two ambulances that were at the disposal of the UN in Baghdad had planted sophisticated listening devices that were planted, well, I don't know who did it, but it was not Iraq, it was the UN or somebody working under the umbrella of the United Nations. All of this, ladies and gentlemen, I'm coming now to the last part of this hurried presentation to you, points to the need of reforms. Major reforms are needed. Catchwords here, more I cannot present. One surely is multipolarity. The other one is multilateralism. If we continue to have in that United Nations a Western Avenue, a one-way street towards our priorities, if we follow the advice again of this representative Bolton at the UN, who said the United Nations must be more interested in US priorities, otherwise we go elsewhere. Well, if you have that approach, it doesn't look good for UN reforms. I prefer what Mr. Exworthy said. Lloyd Exworthy, when I was in Baghdad, said in the Security Council, the UN must do that which is of benefit for the international community and not just for the interest of individual member states. And I keep saying he was kind that he added an S to member states. He should have said member state. That probably would have been more accurate. But it is a correct assessment. And isn't it fascinating that the Mexican delegate in 1945, not 2006, in 1945, he had to say this: we have designed, UN, an organization which will control the mice, but the tigers are still on the loose. Well, that was 45. Now, what more? This is the tigers in the last 60 years got pretty fat and are stronger now than they were in 1945. But to reassure you, the reform debate has started, despite Mr. Bolton. It has started with the Secretary General, who talks about these complex issues, how we can return back to a multipolar agenda where the South and the North, where all countries have a chance to make their inputs and define the agenda, and something that is approaching at least multilateralism, so that the agenda is something which, in the spirit of what Mr. Exworthy meant, is pursuing that which is for the common good and not for just individual member countries. And so be prepared for a long, outdrawn debate and controversy and acrimony. It will happen, but maybe with our involvement, also citizen involvement, maybe things can change, and changing they must. Mr. Churchill in Yalta, also in 1945, said the eagles must let the smaller birds sing. Well, I would totally agree. The smaller member countries must be allowed to have a voice. But it's not just enough to let them speak. You must listen to it. And you must take it into account what they say. And the orchestra must play their tune also sometimes. And if that happens, and if we have the controls to avoid a repetition of what happened in Iraq, where one country simply left the community when it wanted and imposed its policies with all these incredible results, I think when that happens, then I think we can relax a little bit. But until that time, I think it's up to us, not just our governments, but also up to us to make our best effort to lead in that direction. You have been kind and patient with me. I thank you, and good evening.
You stay and have some questions?
Of course.
Mr. von Sponeck has agreed to take some questions, and would you like, I'll point the people out.
Sure,
and take
sure,
questions.
sure.
And so if you just raise your hand, I will try to get Ivan with a microphone. He's told me he has tested this microphone, and I've told him that that the penalty for feedback is loss of a limb.
Well.
Yes, sir. Thank you very, very much for that talk. That was, here I am.
Oh, sorry.
That talk was excellent, and I greatly appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
This is a matter of clarification. I understood, and almost certainly incorrectly, that you said that there were something like $29 billion for the people, and there were something like 23 million people, and then it came out to be $183 per person, or
185
but it wasn't
per
that
year.
about $1,000
per year. Per year, per person, 23 million. Over 6.5 years.
The total amount.
Yes.
But
yes.
then per year.
Yeah.
Thank you very
Okay,
much.
not at all.
I understand.
Sure.
Question over here, and at the front.
Pass that down.
Again, I thank you very much for your honesty and your expertise. And I wonder if you'd be willing to share with us from your position how you see this one nation affecting Afghanistan and Palestine, who are also being occupied, and are the people there not under the same oppression because of the one country? I just wonder from the UN position how you see those.
Well, I would say it's a little bit more complex, because in Afghanistan, it's not just one country. In fact, the U.S. is pulling out now, more or less, out of Afghanistan, and it's over to NATO and to a multilateral force under the leadership not of U.S. forces. So it's more complex. The Europeans have this motto to defend European security at the Hindu Kush. I find that ridiculous, quite frankly. I'm not a hardcore pacifist who is not able and willing to change his position, but I don't accept that. And as far as Palestine is concerned, well, I must admit I am not competent enough to comment here. There was a good development through the quartet approach, where the UN, Russia, and the US and Britain were involved, but that was punctuated by both Russia recently, and before that, Mr. Bush forgot that he himself was the first to ignore this by going straight to Mr. Sharon and agree on a new policy for Gaza and the West Bank. But I can't say much more except unilateralism, as far as Iraq is concerned, is very clear. The latching on by a few countries, Mongolia has 7 soldiers in Iraq. That is the coalition of the willing. Afghanistan is a different story, but ladies and gentlemen, I personally very strongly believe that in the debate on terrorism and the manifestations of terrorism, we forget to debate the causes. We talk about the symptoms. We find the symptoms horrific, as I certainly do, but let us debate the causes. And the causes have something to do with human dignity. They have something to do with tolerance. They have something to do with poverty. And if we are not willing to address that, then I think we will see more of what we don't want. So I'm sorry I didn't do a good job in answering, but I don't have better answers. So, yes.
One right in the front row here.
Yeah.
Add my thanks to others in the room for your impassioned expose. Question just about your you spoke of 62 billion to 44 billion, but then you mentioned only 29, I think it was. 28 billion reaching the people in reality. Well, I didn't get the disparity between the 28 and 44. Could you help me with that?
I think that's my fault, because I didn't. I suddenly felt I caught one. I will not tell you who, but there was one person in the audience, at least one, who had his eyes closed. So I thought. So I was thrown a little bit off balance, because normally I do explain that figure. The figure between the 44 and the 28. That difference is due to the fact that the oil for food program was hopelessly bureaucratized, that large amounts of humanitarian supplies were blocked also. In 1 year, for example, in August 2002, $5 billion worth of supplies were blocked by, I'm sorry, this is again not anti-British or anti-American, by 2 governments. Nobody else in the Security Council blocked humanitarian supplies except these 2 governments. And they blocked up to $5 billion. The average was between 3 and 3.5 billion at any one time. But the peak was in August 2002, $5 billion. So with that approach, very high bureaucratization, items blocked, and who wanted to do business with Iraq? A lot of the shady companies came, not the known, also the known, but the known ones. Over 50% of the Iraqi oil ended up in the US, but none of the big American oil companies bought the oil. It was bought by small fly-by-night outfits at whom one could point the finger and said, you paid the kickback. But Exxon, BP, and whoever did not. They just bought from those the oil. Now, that all this complexity of the implementation of the oil for food program explains why such a huge amount of $16 billion was not translated into humanitarian supplies during the time it should have been. And the other difference, one of you could ask, what about the difference between 63 and 44? 63, the total income, oil income, and 44, what was available for the oil for food program as the gross, as the gross figure. Well, that difference is explained by this compensation commission payment, which took from every oil dollar earned 30 cents were sent to Geneva, and that money was used to defray compensation claims, many of which, I didn't tell you that, but many of which were fraudulent, were excessive, whatever word you want to use. There was one claim by the government of Jordan, for example, for $8.1 billion as the cost to look after transiting workers from Iraq and Kuwait who had to go home, guest workers, foreign workers, poor people from Bangladesh, from Pakistan, from India, from the Philippines, from Palestine, who were badly in need of keeping or getting back their $2,000, $4,000, $10,000 that they had saved for their families. They needed to be compensated, no question. But out of the $18 billion of compensation that was paid up to the beginning of the war in 2003, only $3 billion went to the workers, to these people. The other 15 went to firms and to government, but the 8.1 billion that I was referred to, the UN decided 8.1 billion, no. What you get is less than 1% of what you asked for, government of Jordan. You get $72 million. 72 million, not 8.1 billion. So here was a cow, the Iraqi cow was milked all the time, but the milk didn't go to the Iraqi people. That was the problem. In the case of Kuwait, there was another project very interesting. They asked for $111 million for compensation of families that had lost a head of household. Very, very correct demand. But the UN Compensation Commission decided to give 177, not 111, but $177 million, much more than they asked for. So this is, I keep saying, this is a little bit like, here's ice, you go out, you hit another car, you make a dent, it costs 1,500 euros, Canadian dollars, and the insurance company writes back to you, thank you very much, we have seen your claim of 1,500, you are getting 2,200. That's the kind of approach. And our outrage was that this, well, if it happened in normal circumstances, one thing, but it happened at a time when there was not enough medicine in a hospital. There was one radioisotope unit in the entire Iraq. Look, I'm not giving you here stories. You can read this yourself. There was not enough medicine for even the treatment of simple things. After Operation Desert Fox, the 4 nights of heavy bombings, I went every morning to a hospital to see who was coming in there. What did I see? I saw husky, strong, young men and also some women, but I remember the 2 men particularly, sitting in their bed like this, because there was no gauze to cover their burn wounds. There were no basic medicines. And this is what is so outrageous and makes one emotional. But the facts are there. I'm not talking out of the top of my head. It's like a CD that is in my head now, because I've seen it, I've read it, I compiled it to some extent. I tell many stories that I didn't tell you. I told you, for example, nothing about the no-fly zones and what happened to them after President Clinton signed into law the Iraq Liberation Act, after Operation Desert Fox. Under enlarged rules of engagement, the 2 air forces were much more aggressive and a lot of civilian casualties. We documented this, and I was the 2 governments, when I started airstrike reporting, the Secretary General was asked to remove me, and he didn't. I salute him for that. But so the story is a complex one, and the figures are there. What is unfortunately not there is you will see the figure of $28 billion, but what you don't see is the 51 cents. So to make it absorbable, you have to do some work. But the 50 cents is a fact, even though you will not find it in any UN document. You will only find the 28 billion and the 23 million. You have to do the homework yourself to get the full extent of what happened in this human drama in Iraq. Sorry, I'm too long-winded, and I will be much shorter in my...
Ivan has the microphone, and he'll move his way across.
Okay, good. I hope justice will prevail.
Okay.
Hello, and thanks for coming today. I was wondering a couple things. If you could give us an idea, roughly, with your knowledge of Iraq, how many people might have lost their life per year under the Saddam Hussein regime? And if a multilateral intervention had occurred in Iraq, would the insurgency be any different today? And without it, what were the real possibility for changes, the political developments that we had now, constitutional arrangements in Iraq, happen without any kind of an intervention ever?
Yeah, well, I think you're asking a very difficult question. Life lost under Saddam Hussein, a lot of people lost their lives. But if you put it on a scale, what happened for which he is responsible, and how many people have lost their lives as a result of sanctions and an illegal invasion, I venture to say with some confidence that where the scale would be on the international side. That I think is pretty clear. And one should not forget, it's not just about death. Do you think today there's one single family in the entire Iraq that isn't somehow affected by what's happening? Do you think that there is not a trauma across the board? So what about those who live? Many of them are damaged for good. What about the young people who didn't go to school, who didn't get an education? How are they preparing for life? How will they fare in 10 years? So it's not just about these people who unfortunately lost their life. But I feel uncomfortable sort of balancing one evil against another evil. Saddam Hussein versus what we did internationally. Both are accountable. The justice is not just for losers. Justice is also for those who won. And this is why there is an international peace movement with tribunals that is now trying to make the case against the winners. The insurgency, would it be different? Again, a very difficult question. There was an insurgency when I was in Baghdad. We heard about it, but it was impossible to judge. I was on one weekend, somebody said to me in Sadr City, that in Saddam City, it was called Saddam City, today it's called Sadr City. There was, after the prayers on the Jummah prayers on Friday, there was a shooting outside the mosque. I said, oh, I see. Yes, 9 people got killed. I would ask other people, and they would say 2. Another one would say, yes, there was shooting, but nobody was killed. It was impossible to get a picture. I don't know. Your question is unanswerable as far as I'm concerned. I don't know. Today, Iraq is angry. The nation is angry, and the range is from criminal behavior here to resistance, passive resistance here. The majority of the people are angry. They don't want the forces there. And so I can only speculate, but I don't want to do that because it doesn't get us very further, how the insurgency would look today if the occupation hadn't happened. But it's an important question nevertheless, so thank you.
Yeah, thank you for your comments, Graf von Sponeck. Can you tell us anything about Canadian involvement in the Oil for Food program through the bank BNP Paribas or Parsaga Holdings?
Yeah. Well, the Volcker Commission, of course, looked at Canadian companies, looked at us, looked at me, looked at anyone who was associated with this program, and I don't know of Canadian firms that did business with Iraq because we had nothing to do with the commercial side of this transaction. Saddam Hussein's government had a direct access to firms. The UN in New York would only verify that the pricing, and they didn't even do that consistently, that the pricing was not excessive. But essentially the transaction was between the ministry in Baghdad and the supplier and a whole range of official institutions like ministries of defense, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, trade boards, and so on. The BNP, Banque Nationale de Paris, Paribas, was the holder of the Iraq oil account. This is where Iraq's oil revenue was deposited. In other words, no money went into the hands of the Iraq government out of its legal sales of oil. What happened alongside with that, I referred to it briefly, the kickbacks, the surcharges, the illegal piping of oil to Syria or into the Gulf. That is another story. I don't think anyone can quantify the degree of illicit income here. The Economic Intelligence Unit of The Economist talks about between $1 and $2 billion a year as extra income. That's about all I can say. I cannot say anything whatsoever about Canadian companies that were involved because I simply don't know. Okay?
Thank you very much for your presentation tonight. I really appreciate your perspectives, where you're coming from. I'm just wondering if you could comment briefly on the geopolitical stand or perspective of the United States in terms of its involvement in the world. If you look at Nicaragua and Panama and Grenada and other places in South America that have Haiti, for instance, governments that have been overthrown, democratically elected governments, Chile too, and then all of a sudden Iraq is the bad guy. We know about Saddam Hussein, and I'm glad you talked a bit more about it. But I've just wondered if the reality is, if there was no oil in Iraq, would the U.S. have done the preemptive strike that it did, along with help from Britain or support from Britain? And also, was this really a test case to let the Arab world know that you better not really take your own country into your own countries into your own hands too much, because we are really the big brother watching you? That's a fairly broad question. It may not involve the UN, but I've met John Humphrey, the founder of the UN and the UN Declaration of Human Rights, and I had great hope for the UN over the years, but I'm losing confidence and hope in the UN because of the impact of one primary superpower that is using its imperial strength to rule the world. Thank you.
I think we should have breakfast together tomorrow, because that's a heavy one. But the book that is out there brings in a new element which I find quite interesting, and that is the U.S. Treasury tried very hard and very successfully to prepare the ground for high levels of investment in Saudi Arabia in the 50s and 60s and so on. And the same, the author of this book argues, was anticipated, planned for in Iraq. And Saddam Hussein turned a cold shoulder to that. He didn't accept that. So here came a regional leader, became more and more powerful. And in a way, the signs in the late 80s were there that Saudi Arabia, the Gulf, was not such a strong ally anymore. So you needed another ally somewhere, another anchor somewhere. And Iraq, not an ally, but maybe an anchor, could have been the place. Now, it's interesting, Saddam Hussein switched, in my days, when I was in Baghdad, from the dollar for oil accounting to the euro. Iran is planning this month to switch from the dollar to the euro. Now, that's another maybe motive why Iran is on the list, because it could throw this whole global accounting and the lead currency US into jeopardy. And so you talk about the geopolitical perspective of the US. Is Iraq a test case for trying out its power politics? in a very superficial way, I would say Iraq was certainly a case. The Project for the New American Century lays out very clearly in the national security strategy, particularly given the 11th of September, I think it's quite clear that the U.S. is trying very hard not to get hold of 5% of Iraqi oil. That isn't the issue. The issue is the control of that. And the issue is to have a network that stretches from Central Asia into the Middle East and into Latin America that feeds into meeting energy needs. And that need is to be controlled. Japan, Europe need Middle East oil. If you control that, you control also us in Europe and the Japanese. Maybe that is what is much more important as a factor than just the mere 5% of Iraqi oil. Plus a good amount of, unhealthy fundamentalism. Yeah.
No, you have to walk over there and get the microphone.
Sorry.
Thank you.
Maybe it's me.
Turn off your remote. Turn off your remote.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Could you just keep on with with the answer that you gave to the last question? Because
conspiracy theories we can all have. Oh, must I? Better?
Yeah, very good.
But cliche. He who reigns through an imperium will ultimately fall through the imperium. I mean, if you read Toynbee, you can see the cyclical development in history. Empires come and go. I personally do not see that the U.S. has the capacity to sustain the approach that it has chosen, number one. Number two, it is highly unfair to always, as I did during my presentation, to talk about the U.S., because the U.S. has many faces, and there is an internal resistance also that is developing and strengthening in the U.S. Congress, in the U.S. public, in the NGOs. And there are many really admirable NGOs that work under extremely difficult circumstances. So I think it is a composite of pressures from outside and from inside that will maybe bring about changes that are not necessarily planned in Washington. The economic situation in the U.S. doesn't look good at all. The social conditions in that country are not, to me, as an outsider, what little I know, very, very impressive. Over half of the people are not health insured. The scissor of poor and rich is widening. Business executives are, I read on a poster for Canadian corporations, very interesting, that the average income of a CEO for the first 100 companies in Canada is $3,450 Canadian dollars per hour. Well, in the US it's probably higher. And this doesn't go unnoticed. And I think this is also a trend in Europe, and we are worried about it, the scissor that is widening. So my guess is, if you force me to speculate, is that within not too long from now, this saga, this cul-de-sac in which they are traveling and driving their vehicle will simply force the stopping of that vehicle. I don't see how it's sustainable.
A very short question. What happens with the Iraqi oil today? Where does it go? And whoever takes it pays for it or just is taken away?
Well, first of all, 5% of the oil revenue continue to go to the UN Compensation Commission in Geneva. The Iraqi government is very unhappy about this. Where the oil goes, how it is accounted, I have absolutely no clue whatsoever. All I can say is that the figures about oil production are still way below what they were when Iraq operated under sanctions, when Iraq was not allowed to repair its oil industry. It exported at the peak between 2.1 and 2.2 million barrels a day. The figures today are well below that. So Iraq is suffering from a lack of output due to also sabotage, doesn't have the income for reconstruction, but how the oil accounting is done, I just don't know.
I receive a strong sense of sadness and helplessness from your presentation. You indicate all the problems, all the injustice, all the failures that what the UN did. It's certain that we won't know how bad will be in Iraq if U.S. didn't went into Iraq. But what we know right now is what UN has failed to do. But as you being a very influential member in the UN, but you resigned. Certainly, I assume there's nothing more that you can do to change the situation. The second question is, on the individual level, what can we do as common citizens, very typical citizens of another country? What can we do? What should we do?
Yeah.
And then you said that to reach the multilateralism, we must listen and take account to what the weak have to say. But again, what should we do about the tiger, the USA? I mean, we are just individuals.
Yeah. Well, let me. You are giving me a lot of homework here, and I just want to say what I can do is simply clarify my own mind, to try and be to balance emotion and this. The temptation to be over-emotional, to overreact is very strong. Arundhati Roy said, and she said it so beautifully, what you have seen, you cannot unsee. And I've seen it, and therefore I cannot unsee it, and it affects me. But not to the extent that I cannot, I hope, rationally put forward my objections. What we can do at the individual level, you look to me like a young person, and I would say the best weapon that you can create for yourself is education. That allows you to reason, to think, to react, and today we have a wonderful opportunity to really build ourselves with facts, equip ourselves with facts if we're trying hard enough through this haze of this jungle of information, disinformation, half-truth. You can find your way and argue. If you, for example, if you read in the newspaper, Iraq is selling its food and the people are not getting it, then you say, oh, that's too bad. You have no way of judging that. But you can go to UN reports, or could have, that show you that this is not so. And then you know, aha, here, the truth is this. And then you argue better. You will tell people, as I did in Harvard, when somebody didn't expect me at all in a meeting, and tried to say the US had a justification, this was to a student body, the US had a justification to go to war on the basis of a UN mandate. Resolution 1441, I started wiggling. My wife was sitting next to me, and she said, hey, this is a meeting for students. Keep out of this. I said, I cannot. And I got up and I said, I remind you that 1441 was not an empowerment for a country to go to war against you. So information equipped me. And that's my humble advice to you is learn as much as you can, and then you have the power to argue back. And the tigers, will always be there, but make the mice into tigers. We can do fantastic gene manipulation today. So
we have a couple of more questions. We're going to make this one of the last.
Thank you. You mentioned about this aggression recently that you're facing at the UN Security Council. I mean, I just want to get your personal opinion on this. Do you think it is a temporary period, or the current administration, or are we seeing a really change in the U.S. policy for the future? So, I mean, should we be concerned, or just is a temporary period? Just your personal opinion on that. Thank you.
Well, I cannot do more than that. But I want to say the one thing that disturbs me most is that the very country that created some of the finest humanists and supporters of peace, like Eleanor Roosevelt or Bundy, George McBundy, and many other colleagues that I had in the U.S., they are forgotten today. And the more we do what we are doing, what is done to the youth in the U.S., means more and more militarization in the minds. And that is the danger to me. That is the real danger, that people lose their perspective and have to learn it the hard way, maybe even with their lives. I hope this is a temporary phase. In the history books of life, it will surely be, because what are 100 years? Nothing. But right now it's painful, and I just hope that the good forces in the U.S. will win the upper hand. That's all I can say.
This will be the last one.
Sure. So, I have one question about the numbers that you were giving for the Oil for Food program. So there was 60-odd billion that was revenue, and then, but there was 28 billion that went to people, and that worked out to about 50 cents.
51 cents.
51 cents per person per day. But now if you take in the entire amount, then that would have been like a little bit over $1. So would that have made a big difference? Like, I'm wondering, would the Oil for Food program, did it have any chance of actually doing its job?
Yeah. I think that's a very good last question. Thank you. The answer is so clear, no, it wouldn't. The World Bank says $1 a day as an income makes a person live in abject poverty. $1. So 63 billion, if they all had become available, would have made a difference, but not to the extent that we could say the United Nations has been party to maintaining a dignified minimum standard of living for a population that was under sanctions. That's my answer. Thank you.
Terrific.
Yeah. I'm sorry, it was too long.
Oh, no.
I all the time do this. Thank you. Sure.
This was wonderful. Earlier today we talked about. Mr. von Sponeck said that he wanted to write a UN joke book. Somebody told me that the United States did, in fact, go into Iraq because there were WMDs. But WMD just means we meant democracy. Mr. von Sponeck has a very good sense of humor. We had a very nice dinner. We agreed, now you got a dose of some of what we got over dinner, and there was the temptation to change the title of tonight's talk, considering all the doublespeak over Iraq, all the misinformation in Iraq and the control of the totalitarian controls of certain governments, that we were going to rename tonight's talk Orwell Was an Optimist. But we figured this might be too bleak. Mr. von Sponeck said that he was afraid that some people were beginning to close their eyes, and I have to apologize. I failed to explain to him that this is how Canadians applaud. Sure, it's true. All of my students do it this way. But it is not my privilege to thank Mr. von Sponeck on your behalf. That falls to the president of St. Jerome's University, Michael Higgins, who has on more than one occasion inspired a snoring ovation. Mr. Dr. Higgins.
Are you awake, David? You will be on Monday. I think a lot of people, Hans, will be having breakfast with you tomorrow. There were certainly more than enough questions, and I think it's a very clear sign, a very clear indication of the enormous interest here tonight in this community at large in the issues around Iraq. David opened by talking briefly about Amazing Grace. He meant, of course, Amazing Church, but in a way, Amazing Grace is even better, because it's a wonderful illustration, I think, of the opportunity in an academy like this to have somebody with your international expertise, but also your deep personal touch, to come and to give a lecture under the auspices of the Wintermeyer family. One of the things about John Wintermeyer, not only in terms of his legacy of integrity in political office in the province of Ontario, but a Harvard-trained lawyer and a person of considerable prominence in the local community, John also went back to school in his 60s and 70s to study the Second Vatican Council, to go back into a classroom to talk about, as was the case earlier with Gaudium Spes, the importance of bringing the Church to the world, not rejecting it, but listening to it. I was thinking of that in the context of one of your remarks tonight when you said one of the best things you can do is education. And that's indeed what we have all done tonight. And that's what the St. Jerome Center for Catholic Experience does. It's the public ongoing education wing of this university, because we recognize the importance of continuing these debates, providing information, reacting to disinformation, and bringing some of the best people indeed on the planet to come and to share their expertise with you. Some of that can be found in the many books that are here tonight through the Wordsworth book people who come all the time quite faithfully, and they drag their books with them, so please help them by providing them with the opportunity of dragging fewer back with them. There are lots of books out there, but there is not Hans-Christof's UN humor book. As David indicated, he's still working on that. That's a bit behind my own Vatican humor book. We were talking about that tonight in the context of exchanging stories about Vatican ambassadors. Hans was indicating that the finest diplomatic corps in the world is that of the Vatican. That's in fact true. And if you have had an opportunity to meet various of the papal nuncios, you realize that they are not only masters through the Pontifical Academy, Ecclesiastical Academy that trains them for the diplomatic life, but also provides them with a taste for the finest wines and for the finest food and for some of the finest objets d'art to be found on the planet. But quite outside the Vatican and UN humor books, there is a deeper, serious and grave component, of course, in tonight's talk, and that is the need for meaningful international structures that engage and that are responsible. Earlier this afternoon, I had dinner with Ado Sedra, who is the Dean of Engineering at the University of Waterloo, no small academic in his own right. Well, he's small in a way, he's my height, but he's no small figure on the international scene. And he was talking about the Walter Bean lecture that was given yesterday about water, a scientist from the University of Alberta, Cambridge University trained, who gave a lecture that Ado said was really rather depressing in its import, because it indicated only too clearly that the kind of issue that happened at Walkerton will most likely happen again. And it's not because the expertise is not there, and it's not because the competence isn't there, or the technology, it's because the will isn't there. The way of working it out somehow, of bringing people together for applied expertise to prevent things like that happening. Well, if that's true in the province of Ontario, how much more so is it true on the international stage? And so the issue of unilateralism clashing with globalization is put within not only its local context, which is a microcosm, but within the larger context, which is the macrocosm. Part of understanding that, of course, and this I particularly appreciated in Hans' reflection, is the rejection of what he calls a market Darwinism, which we have seen play itself out with all its ugly aftermath in the current Iraq situation. And so Hans came to a brief recapitulation of the history of the Iraq crisis and reminded us, because we seldom realize this, that Saddam Hussein's transparent brutality has to be counterbalanced with the opaque brutality of the UN and of US policy. It was interesting then to see the clever juxtaposition of Mr. John Bolton at one end and Mr. Lloyd Axworthy at the other, one representing a genuine and humane multipolarism, the other representing the worst of national insularity in the interests of the national state. What we need is a multipolar agenda. And it may be that prescient diplomat in Mexico in 1945 talking about mice and the tigers would be quoted again and again over the years following, because in a way he got it right, but not completely right. But it is safe for us to assume, as we've heard tonight, that Hans-Christof is the mouse that roars. An eloquent, brave, and relentless moral voice. Thank you, sir.
Very nicely put. I just want to point out that Michael was too shy to mention it, but copies of his book, Stalking the Holy, you'll remember Michael gave a talk here at the St. Jerome Center, which was supposed to be partly a book launch, and the book was not available at the time, thanks to some publisher's disagreement. The book is available at the table, and Michael is willing to sign those books. As well, at the back, at the Wordsworth table, you can get tickets for a talk that the St. Jerome Center is helping to organize with Wordsworth book. Karen Armstrong, the author of the best-selling A History of God, The Battle for God, and The Spiral Staircase. If you recall, she spoke about the spiral staircase from this stage. She will be here, actually not here, at the First United Church in Waterloo, Ontario, on Saturday, April the 1st, no fooling, at 2 p.m., and if you would like to go to that event, there are tickets for sale at the Wordsworth table. Our next event at the St. Jerome Center is Douglas John Hall, Canada's most prominent Protestant theologian. We had Canada's preeminent Catholic theologian earlier in the year, so we'd like to balance things out. And this is on March the 24th, same time, same place. And the talk is Many Churches, Many Faiths, One Planet, in keeping with the spirit of tonight's talk. I wanted to add my thanks to Mr. von Sponeck for a wonderful visit and wonderful talk. I wanted also to thank Dr. Neil Arya. Dr. Arya spoke in the context of Challenge for Change, which St. Jerome's is a sponsor of, a couple of years ago. And Neil was president of the Canadian chapter of the International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War, a group that won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1985. And the Canadian chapter is called Physicians for Global Survival. And Neil was former president of that. You haven't gone back, eh, Neil? No. And finally, I just would like to thank Michael for being so gracious in his thank you. Carol Person, the secretary of this center, and her husband Ivan, who volunteers his time to be here every Friday. As well, I can't thank everyone who makes these events possible, but I would like to thank you, our audience, for your generous support of the St. Jerome Center. You're here every few weeks, and oh yes, I can't forget, as a treat, as our thank you, there is a special lecture on Monday, March the 6th. This hasn't been publicized in our brochure because it was very much a last thing. Noel Sheth, Jesuit priest, former president of a pontifical institute in India. I've forgotten my notes in front of me. He will be speaking. He will be speaking on Hindu-Christian dialogue, especially on the topic of the Incarnation. So he will be talking about that in the chapel of Sweeney Hall, 7:30 on the chapel, Monday, March the 6th. Did I say something else? Monday, March the 6th. I often do say other things. Monday, March the 6th, as Michael will tell you, I often do talk nonsense. Monday, March the 6th, 7:30, Sweeney Hall Chapel. And this promises to be a very exciting talk, since this is a guest from India that we have lucked into at the last minute. Not that many people know about it, so we don't expect to have, as well, Siegfried Hall won't be available, so it will be held in the chapel, and you are all most welcome. The event is free. So I guess it just stands that I should thank you all for your continuing support of the Center and wish you good night. Thank you.